Hello everybody, welcome back to a budget update. So it's 2022, and I think it's been 4 years since I've done one of these. So I wanted to just kind of show you some of the updates that I've done that I have found to make running my budget for my family much easier. So we left off with something like this. This is, I believe, roughly where we left off. I think I did another update video earlier as well. And so I wanted to show you the current edition, which looks like this. You'll notice that I have moved the categories to the vertical column on the left. The main reason that I did this, and the reason I find this really helpful, is this way I can add as many categories as I want to without really running out of room. In the older version, with each category having its own column, it was really limited as to how far east and west I could go. The more categories I had, the more cumbersome the appearance of the overall budget became. But once I shifted it over here to the left, then I can now add many more categories and have it only take up just a minimal amount of space. And I found that immediately helpful as I've added several categories as my spending habits have changed. And that's the thing, right? All of our families' spending habits are going to change from year to year, or as a new kid comes or a kid goes or anything like that. As life changes, our budget needs to change. All I had to do was just take these categories and shift them over. So now what was in row 2 is now in column B. Instead of going down, we go across. And so in that way, it's a very simple transition. Another thing you'll notice is from the old version, I had my assets down here to the left. I decided to move those over here and combine them with the same section of my budget for the allotments and the categories. And the reason I decided to do that was because I want to keep track of where the money is coming from. When in this case, when Gideon spends, spends his money on a new set of shoes or something, is that coming out of the checking account? Is that coming out of the money market account? Is that coming out of savings? Where is that money coming from? And I found that was really helpful for me to start keeping track of that, like which pocket is the money coming out of. Sometimes I was transferring money out of my checking account into my savings, or vice versa. Or sometimes I would pay for something out of my savings account and not my checking account. And I just found that for me, not knowing which pocket the money was coming out of was actually ruining the accuracy of my budget as I was looking back in the past and looking at previous expenses that I made. So I decided to start including a spent record for each of my categories. So if I had to spend something out of my emergency fund, then it's recorded as coming out of a different pocket than coming out of my checking account. And you'll notice if you look over here at my expenses, I've added a source category. In the original, we just had category, and that aligned with these categories across the top, right? And then payment method. But now in the new one, I have payment method and source, and it shows each of these sources, so I know I can keep a better record of where is the money coming from. And I found that that's really nice in keeping an accurate record of my expenses. You can also see that Gideon and Hazel have added a few extra asset accounts down here, including keeping track of their estimated home value and the current loan balance. As to have it be a true reflection of your assets, you need to know your loan to value ratio on any property that you have purchased. And so I've included that down there as well. Now you'll notice I'm not going to be spending anything out of the home value, so I leave that X'd out. These just return a nil value when everything in here is a bunch of zeros. But as soon as I start entering numbers into these categories, you'll notice that all of these equations turn on. So if our checking account at the end of the month is 5,000, that turns all of these on and they start doing their math. So this is just a good way to hide inaccurate information that wouldn't be helpful at all. And the way that I did that was just with a simple if function. So if the sum of this column equals 0, then just return a dash. But if the sum of this column does not equal 0, then go E26 minus C26, and E26 is this, and C26 is this. But as soon as you start entering numbers in here, then these will turn on, and then it becomes more accurate at that point. The whole point of this budget is to make things easy on me, and the fewer things that I have to remember, the fewer caveats that I have to think about, the better. Something else that I've done, you'll notice I have a little discoloration right here. That's to remind me that while all of these other allotments I type in, Gideon and Hazel will type into their budget at the beginning every month when they do their budget together, this one is actually a formula where it's D10, which is right here. It's the amount that they're going to pay for tithing. It's D10 times 1.5, and then round it to the second decimal. If I rounded it to the third decimal, then that would carry it out to thousandths. We don't want thousandths, we just want hundredths, right? And the reason I did this is because lining up with Dave Ramsey's baby step number 4 of his total money makeover, invest 15% of your income. Gideon and Hazel here, they're trying to follow the baby steps. And so they want to have their PYF, their pay yourself first, the money that they're setting aside for their wealth building. They want that to be 15% of their income. Well, they're paying consistently 10% of their income. And you can see that this 10% lines up with how much money they made last month. My thought process here was, well, then all Gideon, rather than doing 2 calculations, having to calculate 15% for PYF and then 10% for tithing, just whatever you type into tithing, that essentially tells the budget that's 10%. So just times 10% by 1.5 and that'll give you 15%. And so that way I only have to type this number in here, and then it automatically tells me what I should be setting aside for PYF. So the reason it's a round function is because if you take 15% of something, you may not get a perfectly whole number. The decimals might be going out to the thousandths place, and that doesn't help us. And so I told it to round to the second integer, thus giving us just hundredths. So that's why that's built the way it is. As I said a second ago, I've enjoyed adding little shortcuts here and there that make my job easier to do. Up here, I've added just how much money we are budgeting with, right? So the idea is that each month you're budgeting based upon the money that you are going to make or that you did make. Now, Gideon and Hazel, they do it based on how much money they did make. That number just pulls from R14, which is right here. And so whenever you transfer over to a new month, and you copy this data. So this is the month of April filled out to fruition. And so once you're moving this over to May, you're going to take this number, right? Because it's April right now. You're going to take this number, plug it in there. And then once you do that, it'll automatically change this number over here. And again, the idea being that when you and your partner, or Gideon and Hazel in this example, are sitting down and planning out next month's budget, or this now month's budget, they know how much they have to budget for. And that's what this is down here. You'll notice that this is a formula, is a sum, which is a total of D4 through D23. So that's just all these. And that equals that right there. And so the idea is that this needs to be less than this, because this is how much money you made last month. And so we have to make sure that however much we're going to spend is not greater than this number, otherwise we're breaking our budget, right? We're spending more money than we made. Now I've got a little note here to remind myself that this needs to include the credit card payment. Let's go to the end version. When I think about how much money Gideon and Hazel had to put into paying off their credit card, that needs to be included into the expected amount of money that we need to budget with, because $2,500 is going to pay off the credit card, and then the remaining needs to be paying off all of these bills. And if the total of the credit card payment with the total of all your whole allotment section is greater than this number, then you're breaking your budget. You're spending more than you made. So that's why I put that there. It's a bit redundant. It's just the same number in those 2 locations, but it's a good way for me to just easily see in the same part of the sheet how much I'm budgeting for, or how much I'm budgeting with. That's pretty much all the changes that I've made over here in the asset and category budgeting section. The expense tracker, I've already kind of showed you. The only thing I really added was the source section. So just to remind you, this is how you set up a drop-down menu. You come up to data, data validation, select from range. Where do you want the range or the list to come from? And so you just click on select range and you just highlight this list. And you'll notice it does B26 through B32. You press OK, press save, and then this list exactly mirrors this list down here. And so anytime you change anything down here in these few cells, it'll automatically change them here. Now, obviously, it's very likely that you're going to be spending money from your index funds. That may never happen, but in the event that it does happen, it's just right there. So in this example, right, you can see that Gideon and Hazel actually transferred $1,000 into their emergency fund. If you follow Dave Ramsey's Total Money Makeover, that's baby step 3. And so they actually spent $1,000 out of their checking account, but it went into their emergency fund. So that's why it's a negative 1,000, because in this case, positive numbers refer to how much was spent. And so if it's a negative number, that means how much was earned or gained, right? Or not spent, the opposite of spent, gained or credited. And so that's why this is how I've taken to recording transfers from account to account, so that I know what is happening without it being spent. Because that was one thing that I really didn't like about my last system on this old one, is if I, like this right here, with Hazel's transferring of $350 into her PYF, this budget records that as an expense, as in to say that money left her control, went out of her pocket into the wide world, and it was no longer hers. But the reality is that it is hers, right? If she just transferred it to her emergency fund savings account, that is still her money. So we have, this shows a record of her having spent the money and no longer having it, when in reality she does still have it. And I didn't like that incongruency. So with this system, I show that it was quote unquote spent, but also immediately received back into the new account. And therefore, when you come down here at the end of the month and you see the spent record, we can see that we spent a negative $1,000 into the emergency fund. And that's the way that I've started keeping track of those kinds of transfers. And you'll notice I've also taken to boxing expenses that are directly linked to each other. So for example, these two are the same. If you come down to this series of expenses at Costco, it was all one purchase that totaled $486.77. If you looked on the receipt, that's what the receipt would say. But some of that money went to food storage, some of that money went to the pet toys, some of it went to clothing, some of it went to groceries. You can see that they're allocated appropriately there. And so to make this record more accurate, I've split the receipt up into its 4 different sections, but also for my own record keeping, when I'm looking back at records or something, he's going to be looking for a $486.77 purchase, even though not all $486.77 of it went to the same category. And so this is a note-taking system that I've started to do that I find really nice, again, for keeping a more accurate record of expenses. And then again, just as a reminder, if you find that these note sections are too small, remember that you can type 1 billion words in here and it'll just stay in there, but you can click on the cell and it's available up here, pretty much to an infinity number of characters. And even if you don't like that, if that falls short, you can always right click, come down to insert note, and then you get a cell there, and that just hides behind a little triangle. Then all you have to do is hover your mouse over, and that's there too. So there's a couple different ways that you can keep track of multiple notes without needing to have a large note-taking section. Something else that I did is I consolidated the bills with the credit card and the ATM, only allowing for one of each, really, because I just did it so rarely. Only once a month did I pay off my credit card or do an ATM withdrawal, and so I consolidated it. Of course, if you make more payments or more withdrawals, then maybe that's not the right idea for you. If you want to have more than that, you can take these and move them down underneath so that they're down here, much more like the old system in a horizontal way. I think that pretty much updates you to what I've done with the expense section. Looking over at the income section, nothing's really changed there. It's all pretty much the same. The monthly bills section, if we look at the old one, you'll see that I just did X's, but that was back before Google Sheets introduced the checkbox option. And they have now introduced a checkbox option, and I love them. I think they're so convenient because, I don't know, it just looks nicer to me than just an X. And you can actually have functions inside of checkboxes. So you'll notice that, like, I'm going to click on this. You'll notice I'm clicking on this, and that box is not checking. But if I were to insert a checkbox and click it, I can check and uncheck that all I want to, because it's not bound to a function. It's just saying false or true. But down here, I can't do that because it's bound to a function. And the function is if E5 equals D5. E5 is right here. D5 is right here. So the subtotal, just like it was on the previous version, right? Subtotal, or in this case, it was running total on the old version. It was just how much money have you spent in that given category. Same thing here with the subtotal. And so it's just going to check the whole expense sheet. And if these two match, then that means you've paid your mortgage. If E5 equals D5, then do true. And that will check the box. And if it's not, if E5 does not equal D5, then click false, and that'll leave the box unchecked. I think the checkbox system is really clean, and so that's what I've done. So I've updated all of my bill pay system for checkboxes. And I made those checkboxes dependent upon, in almost all of these, dependent upon if the allotment equals the subtotal. And that's why PYF here is unchecked, because my allotment does not equal my subtotal. And the reason it doesn't in this case, to demonstrate how this would work, is because of this right here. We spent the 1,401 into the PYF for baby step 3, but then we immediately took it back out. And so as far as the subtotal is concerned, we haven't spent anything, and so that's why this is remaining false. But in reality, I know that it has been spent. It just hasn't been spent out into the world. It's just changed hands inside of my own accounts. And I felt like it's reasonable for this just to remain unchecked in that instance. But if you didn't want that, if you wanted it to record that, then it would be a simple additional, if-then function where if you have two numbers that are the same, except one is the negative of the other, right? You just have to do a little bit of a function on that. Then it would also check the box to do that too. You could do that if you wanted to. I haven't found it necessary for me. Maybe someday I'll decide that that's worth my time. Now, one thing I've also added to my monthly bills is the non-monthly bills, like my cell phone bill. I do a prepay, 12-month prepay system. So we have two phones, Gideon's phone and Hazel's phone. So one gets paid in May, one gets paid in July, and so those are there to remind me, hey, when it's time for May, like it will be next month, remember to budget for your cell phone bill. And when it's July, remember to budget for that cell phone bill as well. And this directly connects to this down here. It's unpolished right now. That's because I'm still figuring out how exactly I want it to work. But I mean, it would be no different than any of these other sections. The idea here is this is a record of all of the non-monthly subscriptions or payments or bills that you have to do. And so this kind of ties to this. There's no functions tying those two together, but you easily could. In fact, you could easily use some of this space up here in the title. You could unmerge that, and you could have a little function right here if you wanted to. Just block that off and say, if it is the current month of one of these bills down here, then this could come up with a little notice that says subscription, and that would light up if something down here, one of these months, matches the month that's up here. And that just lets you know, hey, you've got something you need to check down here when you're setting up your allotment. In fact, I think that's a really good idea, and I'll probably do that. But I just hadn't thought about it until just this very second. So, yay, revelation. Again, as always, you want your budget to be the most accurate and in-depth record of all of your expenses as possible to make controlling and spending and saving and budgeting and building your wealth as easy as possible. And then scrolling down here to the bottom right section, I've added a couple little things, but mainly my idea for this region of your budget is that it's your utility, your versatility section, where you just add anything else that you need to keep track of. So for example, Vexalia was the name of a vehicle that Gideon was babysitting for one of his cousins. Gideon was going to keep track of it, and so they made a little contract, and that's a link to the contract in Google Doc. And then there's a mileage tracker for that doc. So those links are there. And then did we update the mileage? That's just a manual check or whatever. But this was just one example of how Gideon uses the budget to also keep track of his other monthly tasks and things that he needs to keep track of. Something else that I added, Gideon, they've got their short-term savings account, and its function is used for small purchases. And so this was a section that I created to keep track of the individual saving for those small purchases. So for example, Gideon and Hazel want to save up for a water softener, and that's going to cost them about $5,000. Well, they're not going to probably do that all in 1 month, so they start to trickle money into that desired purchase, just 1 month at a time. And so this is a way to keep track of, okay, well, there are $1,100 in the savings account. How much of that is for the water softener? And so that just gets put, and you would manual entry that, you're just punching that in manually, because it's going to be based upon however much you and your partner decide is going into that account for that reason. And because you have that section over here on the right where there's nothing really important below it, then you can make this section as large as you want to keep track of as many of your savings projects as you want to. And then this, of course, is just going to be a sum function of this column, letting you know how much money is in the account. And in theory, this number should match up with the savings account number at month start, but you're going to have little interest payments that are coming into that savings account that might mess that up a little bit. So as long as it's relatively close would be good enough in my book, because at the end of the day, this number is the most important number. And then something down here, we have a handyman named Mitch that we like to have him help with small projects here and there. And so this is where Gideon and Hazel keep track of their little individual projects that they want to have their handyman help them out with when that time comes. And again, a checkbox, and then how much they're going to spend, like if the handyman gives them a quote. Again, you certainly don't have to do this, but the main reason I'm just showing this to you is showing you that this section down here in the bottom right, as well as down here in the bottom left, can be a great way for you to just keep track of whatever it is you want to keep track of. You can take pictures of your pay stubs and put copies of those pictures here. In fact, let me just show you how to do that. If you wanted to insert a picture into your Google Sheets, which is something that I have absolutely done, you would just come up to Insert, Image, in Cell. And then it pulls you up to here where you can either upload it from your computer, in which case you would just search through your file system and find it. Or if you have a URL, if you want to upload a picture from a URL, then you can enter that there. If you want to search for a picture, I don't really know why you would, but you totally could. If you want to search into your Google Photos, you would click on that. That'd take you into your Google Photos or photos that are in your Google Drive. Let me just show you how that looks. Okay, so I just grabbed a Creative Commons picture of a puppy, just used the URL, and I pasted it in here. You'll notice it's off there to the side and it's really small, but if you merge a bunch of the sections together, then it just automatically increases the size of the image. And so if you wanted it to take up a bunch of space, you can do that, or you can just leave it small, in which case you could have, I don't know, you could have your entire screenshot of your tax returns all just right there, and it'd only take up a few cells. You could have all of your pay stubs right there. You could have any number of documentation that you took a screenshot of, or a picture off of your phone or anything like that, and actually store it inside of your budget and just have it tucked away somewhere where it would just take up so little space. So that, again, that's what I love about Google Sheets, is that it's just so versatile. It just allows you to do whatever it is you would like to do. Okay, well, that's pretty much it. That's the update for what Gideon and Hazel have done with their budget sheet since 2018 when we last saw them. Hopefully there's something in here that was helpful for you, some tips or tricks that you might consider using for your budget. I also wanted to make a quick announcement that I'm setting up a secondary channel. This announcement is for all the nerds out there, all the gamers. So you may have noticed over here a link to like D&D Beyond. I've mentioned this before. Gideon and Hazel are really big into Dungeons and Dragons and other nerdy games like that. And so I'm actually planning on starting up a channel. It's called Spark Creations, that is going to be releasing some videos here this summer. And so if you're interested at all in that kind of nerdy stuff, then feel free to check that out. Again, the channel's name is Spark Creations, and I'll have a link for it down in the description of this video. But also, as of right now, publishing this in May, the channel has no content yet. I'm planning on tackling that over the summer here. I am planning on actually giving away some dice from D&D Beyond that they've allowed me to kind of give away in their name as a sponsorship kind of a deal. So if you're interested in getting some dice, you might consider staying tuned for that kind of thing. Thank you so much for watching, and happy budgeting.